a great pleasure to welcome you to this special event and to introduce Ken Hiltner. And to those of you, those of you who have interacted with Ken since he arrived in the fall, know that he's doing great things for us here in the Environmental Studies program. I'm going to just make a few comments about that and about Ken in this introduction. So Ken is the Curry C. and Thomas A. Barron visiting professor in the Environmental Humanities, and he is here for a whole academic, the whole 2012 to 2013 academic year. And his visit is truly a collaboration between the ENV program, the Environmental Studies program, which I direct, which sits inside of the Princeton Environmental Institute, which has the mission of coordinating thinking and doing about the environment and environmental problems, and coordinating those kind of thoughts and issues around campus. And also the Department of English, whose chairperson is here, Bill Gleason. Nice to see you. So it's a true collaboration, and it's a collaboration that delivers very well on Curry and Thomas Barron's generous gift and their vision of bringing the humanities as a strong partner and a critical and essential partner in the debate and discussion about how we think about the environment, how we relate to the environment, and how issues of the environment relate to the human condition. And you know, we all have different perspectives on this, but I just give you my own, is that in the area of the environment and environmental problems, I think science and engineering often has led, historically, from my perspective, of promising solutions and so on. But it's so clear, and it's so clear to our undergrads, and it's so clear the more we think about this, that reflection on the human condition and on what it means to be part of this endeavor of changing the world and being confronted with how to manage the world is just at heart. Even that question even comes before you do the scientific experiment. So there's a tremendous potential and importance, I think, to bring these groups together, and yet we don't always do it so well. And that's the unique thing that Ken does and has done in his whole career. So in many ways, this delivers on the generous gift. So in Ken, we found a true collaborator, and his ability is, unfortunately, he holds a rare ability to make this kind of link. It's very interesting to reflect on, and I don't think we should do it today, and I think maybe it's exactly what he will, so I'm not going to do it, on what this connection means and why it sometimes works and sometimes does not work to build a bridge between humanities and sciences when it comes to the environment. Let me say a few things about Ken. He's an associate professor in the Department of English.
Full professor.
Oh, sorry, full professor. The CV says associate, sorry. In the Department of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He directs the Literature and Environment program, which is a very large program and has grown and he's tried to do hands-on exactly the kinds of things that we've done for so long, but that we're beginning to accelerate and try to promote here at Princeton. Very important thing is that Ken, in fact, grew up locally here on a farm in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, where he witnessed the transformation of the New Jersey landscape. He received his bachelor's degree from Rutgers. I think after that, he had artistic interest in woodworking and other things, and then decided that he had an academic calling, came back to write exactly this interface of literature and environment. He got his PhD at Harvard, and his dissertation was titled Renaissance Ecology, Environmental Consciousness and Crisis in English Literature. So right at the interface of literature and environment. Ken is tremendously productive, and among his publications is a recent book on Renaissance literature and the environment, exploring the question of what does it mean, what does a pastoral landscape mean. He's in the middle of writing his third monograph on nature and art, essential questions in environmental criticism. And let me just note that I can't understate the impact that Ken has had on our program, EMV program, and I think our Princeton undergraduates and the links that we have to the humanities in the EMV program here more broadly in Princeton. He's currently teaching theories of literature and the environment for EMV and for the English department, and he's coordinating something quite unique, a 2-day conference on the topic Environmental Humanities in a Changing World. It's to be held March 8th and 9th here, and he will bring together leaders from a range of fields in the environmental humanities and as well as artists. So this is what he's doing among other things here at Princeton. So we're very pleased to have you here, Ken, and thanks for all the things you're doing and have done. And the title of your talk today is The Two Cultures in Environmental Studies.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Great. Oh, thank you, Lawrence. Well, thanks very much for that, Lars. And I want to thank everyone else in a minute, but first I did want to explain my title. It actually is drawing from a title from an essay and then became a talk that was delivered 50 years ago at Cambridge University, entitled just The Two Cultures. Two cultures being the humanities and the sciences. And it was written by C.P. Snow, who felt that he had a foot in both worlds because he was a scientist, trained as a scientist, also was a prolific novelist. Unfortunately for C.P. Snow, he wasn't very good at either of those things. So his most famous contribution in science was that he thought that he had synthesized vitamin A, a lot of fanfare, a lot of publicity, and he was wrong. He didn't do it. So that didn't help his career much at that end. And literary critics have not been very kind to C.P. Snow over the years. But the idea of the two cultures was a really important one. And the two cultures, of course, the sciences and the humanities. What worried C.P. Snow was that these two cultures no longer understood each other, no longer had the same language, same jargon, the same methodology, and in fact, they began to have misgivings about each other, the sciences and the humanities. And he often felt that it led to sort of almost contempt on one side or the other. So 50 years later, I think the two cultures are still here, generally. But in academia, it's interesting because we've wound up kind of separating the two out. So most universities have separate division for science, separate division for humanities, separate deans, separate funding, separate ways of doing things. Sometimes we even give separate degrees, Bachelor of Humanities, Bachelor of Arts, rather than Bachelor of Science. So even when there's interdisciplinary work, it tends to be in one culture or the other. But the question and the challenge, which I think is facing, and Lars was tapping into it, environmental studies programs all over the country now, how do you integrate these two very different cultures together? How do you literally bring them under one roof? And it's true. The sciences, when environmental studies programs first started emerging 40 years ago, the sciences were the groups that put these together. Part of the reason is there just weren't that many people doing work in the environmental humanities then. Now that's changed dramatically. But it is the case, and having been around a little, I can tell you that many environmental studies programs really don't see the value of the environmental humanities. So with pressing environmental concerns like we have now, things like the rise of atmospheric CO2, climate change, the question is how do people in the humanities help with that? I should say, though, and this just piggybacks on what Lars said, that there's an enormous effort here at PEI, Princeton Environmental Institute, to do just that, to integrate these two cultures together. It's why I'm here. In part, this is the sort of foresight of Tom Barron and others. It's been going on for well over a decade here. So, my talk today is going to focus on what I think is one of the largest reasons that the two cultures do not get along. And I'm afraid to say, and it saddens me to say, that this has come from the humanities. And it's in part a very old tradition from literature, but the humanities sort of have endorsed this, and it has caused misgivings toward the sciences. The good news is I think this is changing dramatically. So what I want to do today is actually display what people like me do. I'm going to do a historical analysis of an idea. For the benefit of the literary people in the room, it's going to be at a breakneck speed. It's going to be doing all the things that we don't do nowadays, which is being very focused and historically accurate. I want to do 5,000 years of Western literature in just a few minutes, and I'm going to draw some big consequences from it. So feel free to call me on little things that are going on. And for the scientists in the room, I'm going to be talking about things like genetic diversity, so feel free to call me on that too. So I wanted to start with a question. It's a question I get asked more than any other, and that is, environmentally, when did it all begin to go wrong? The question strikes me as both fair and well-intentioned, but it is deceptively complex. as it raises a number of related to sometimes unspoken questions. What exactly went wrong? Why did it go wrong? How did it go wrong? Who is to blame? These, in turn, are usually just prerequisites. Whoops, hold on one second. Sorry. These are usually just prerequisites for another question, and that is, sorry, my little clicker is not working. Once we understand how our environmental problems began, how might we turn back the clock to repair or at least mitigate the damage done? Even this, however, is often not the end of the line of the questioning because it raises the most worrisome and urgent question of all. Is there still time to make a successful intervention? Now that our environmental problems are truly global in scale, perhaps an irreversible tipping point may soon be reached and passed. While this line of inquiry, I would acknowledge, can certainly be interesting and profitable, today I would like to instead turn inward on the opening question. Instead of looking for answers to it, I would like to primarily to respond to this question with one of my own. Environmentally, why do we think that anything was ever right? I offer this in earnest, as I believe that this question to be a better response than any answer I could muster. Why, indeed, do we believe that human beings once had some sort of harmonious relationship with the past, with the earth rather, that's now lost? Do we believe so it's because it's historically accurate? As we shall see, there's little in the historic record to suggest that human beings ever lived in such bliss. Why, then, is the belief so common? Before tackling this question head-on, it'll be helpful to briefly take up the question of how environmental beliefs emerge and change over time. So to do this, I want to start with an image. Imagine a coal-burning power plant, complete with billowing smokestacks being built not far from where you live. What do you think your impression of it would be? Would it likely seem to be good, beautiful, or anything of the sort? Probably not. It probably would seem the opposite of all that. Yet in the late 1940s, signaling post-war prosperity, it may have seemed like a very good thing, perhaps even beautiful. Surprisingly, ideas towards such power plants reversed in a single generation. So how did it happen? What happened in a variety of ways as we became aware of the consequences of certain environmental practices. For example, the Great Smoke of 1952. Many people have forgotten this, but in 1952, over 10,000 Londoners died in a single week as the result of smoke inhalation, which made clear the horrific dangers that come with the unchecked burning of coal. Not every influence need be so direct. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published a decade later, had little to say about fossil fuels and urban air pollution. Nonetheless, because it alerted millions to the dangers associated with the wholesale release of toxic materials into the environment, it too changed our attitudes toward coal-fired power plants. Because Carson's work was so influential, you did not even have to read Silent Spring to know its basic environmental premise. It just was, discussed in a range of media outlets as well as around water coolers and everywhere else. Ideas and beliefs, and this is important, I think, can spread even more subtly. Child notices their parents wince or sigh discontentedly as they pass a power plant. Nothing need be said or discussed for the child to clearly get the idea. This is a bad thing. The next time they pass the power plant, she too winces. So, as a cultural historian with a focus on the environment, I seek to understand how such ideas and attitudes emerge, change, spread, and sometimes die over time and across cultures. For thousands of years, human beings have been creating texts, artworks, and similar artifacts that both provide a fascinating record of the state of the environment at the time of their creation, as well as document attitudes toward it. Milestone, influential works like Silent Spring are of special interest and significance as they are not only reveal attitudes toward the environment, they change beliefs, sometimes give birth to entirely new ideas. So, returning to our opening question. It assumes that human beings once had some sort of harmonious relationship with our planet, which somehow, somewhere along the way, got lost. So why do we believe it? As with the impressions of coal-fired power plants, a range of works have sometimes subtly, sometimes forcibly shaped this belief. However, unlike the recent flip-flop of attitudes toward power plants, thousands of works over thousands of years have been steadfastly reinforcing this particular idea. The idea was alive and well 5,000 years ago in Sumerian writing, earliest literature of the West. It appears in both the Hebrew and Christian Testaments, as well as the Quran. The archaic period of ancient Greece was presented as historical fact, thanks to Homer's contemporary Hesiod. Centuries later, as Greece was slow declining, the poet Theocritus introduced a new form of literature, which 2,000 years later is still wildly popular, built on a clever offshoot of the idea. It was perhaps not surprisingly also well known to Romans like Ovid and Virgil. The idea flourished throughout the medieval and Renaissance periods. We see protracted discussions of it in Aquinas, Augustine, Calvin, Luther, and countless other theologians, as well as philosophers. In literature, the idea became central in works by Dante, Milton, Wordsworth, and thousands of additional poems, plays, and novels. Michelangelo, Rubens, Blake, Rousseau, and I could go on with artists who imagined it visually, while Mozart, Tchaikovsky, Wagner, Copland, and many more did so musically. So lest you think it an ancient and obscure idea, rest assured it's still alive and well today in works ranging from the poems of Wendell Berry to films like Disney's Pocahontas, the blockbuster Avatar. For our environmental purposes, and this will be important, it's noteworthy that the idea opens both Silent Spring as well as the film version of An Inconvenient Truth, as well as became central to environmental movements like deep ecology. Given that it's such a pervasive idea, it has exerted tremendous force in shaping culture, played a role in the colonization of the Americas, the post-war urban sprawl of the 1940s and 50s, the back-to-the-land movement of the 60s and 70s, the invasion of small-town America in the 80s and 90s. It even influences what we eat through works like the Paleo Diet and the Omnivore's Dilemma. I am, of course, talking about the idea of Eden. As our whirlwind overview suggests, the idea that the earth was once a paradise is an extraordinarily persistent one in the West. In addition to the biblical account of Eden, in Greek literature it appears in Hesiod's nostalgic tale of a lost golden race that lived at peace with themselves and the planet. Incidentally, that was rechristened from the Golden Race to the Golden Age by Ovid and Virgil, which is our more familiar form. Central to these tales was the belief that human beings once lived a perfect life in a perfect paradise where a benevolent Mother Earth provided for their every need. Celebration of pastoral life, formally inaugurated as an art form by the Greek Theocritus, builds on and updates this idea, suggesting that such a wonderful life still exists, though only on the rural outskirts of civilization. So similar are Eden, the Golden Age, and the imagined pastoral places, that scholars use a single Latin term for all three amiable locales, locus amenus, the pleasant place. One of the great myths of the West, the story of the lost paradise, has been repeated and revised for the whole of its history even before. For most of this time, the notion that the earth was once a welcoming paradise that benevolently provided for human beings was taken to be historically accurate. Somewhat improbably, after thousands of years and hundreds of years of modern science debunking the idea, the belief lives on today for perhaps more than 1 billion people, thanks to literal readings of the Bible, the Quran, and offshoot texts like the Book of Mormon. More than a minor tenet of faith, for nearly 100 years, belief in historical Eden has been a conspicuous and controversial feature of the American landscape, thanks to the fact that it stands in defiant opposition to the modern theory of evolution. Belief in Eden is so literal that scores of biblical scholars and explorers have searched the earth for its existence, Christopher Columbus being a notable example, looking for Eden. Today, most believe it was situated somewhere in the Middle East, though many members of the Mormon Church contend it was likely in Jackson County, Missouri. So, although it is tempting to see the idea of the lost paradise as little more than a charming and sometimes amusing myth, belief in a biblical Eden is widespread in the U.S. today. When asked in a 2012 Gallup poll about their views on the origin and development of the human species, 47% of Americans responded that the following statement came closest to their views, quote, that God created human beings pretty much in their present form at one time within the last 10,000 years. Regarding Eden, the age of 10,000 years is significant, as many biblical scholars agreed that Eden was lost soon after God created the earth, somewhere around 6,000 years ago. Consequently, although Gallup did not specifically ask about Eden, since creationism is rooted in a literal reading of the myth of Eden as recounted in Genesis, the biblical Eden likely figures prominently in the beliefs of many of these Americans, especially as Gallup's related 2005 poll revealed that when given a range of options, 53% of Americans agreed, quote, that God created man exactly as the Bible describes it. So it's important to note, however, can't stress this enough, that while belief in Eden is central to fundamentalist and literal readings of Genesis, it's by no means a major tenet of faith for all Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Beginning at least as early as the 17th century, when faced with the reality of a universe that was obviously no longer geocentric, a number of thinkers began developing strategies for retaining their faith, even though they found Scripture at times inconsistent and doubtful. With the rise of modernity, and with it further challenges to Genesis, such as evolutionary biology, this approach became influential as theologians worked out its tenets and details. For example, since the 1950s, the succession of Catholic popes has largely endorsed evolution, which makes the persistence of the belief of Eden all the more surprising. And I really need to stress this. I think this issue of Eden is less a religious issue sometimes than a textual interpretation issue. So people doing what I do, interpreting a text, is what happens here with Genesis. You can read this text entirely, completely, literally, in which case, yes, 5,000 years ago Eden must have existed, or you can develop, as people have been for hundreds of years now, interpretive strategies for reading it while still retaining your faith in light of discoveries in modern science. In any event, for the surprising number of Americans who believe in the biblical Eden, our opening question has a straightforward answer. Environmentally, it all began to go wrong about 6,000 years ago when God, dispensing punishment for human disobedience, informed Adam that cursed is the ground for thy sake. Cast out of Eden, human beings would no longer be provided for by a benevolent earth. To the contrary, we would have to forcibly take from the earth what we needed, which now brought forth only thorns and thistles. As a further consequence of our sin, not only every human being, and again this is important, but all life on earth, as well as the planet itself, may well be in a fallen state. While human beings can be saved through Christ, who offers a way off the planet and into heaven, the earth and all its plants and non-human beings are arguably in a state of irretrievable decay. Consequently, in this view, the environmental tipping point for our planet may have occurred 6,000 years ago. I have to say, although I admit to being really fascinated by the persistence of the belief in a literal Eden in the 21st century, I'm even more intrigued when the idea is openly rejected, though in some sense, surprisingly, still firmly embraced. Belief in Eden may seem like little more than a superstition to some Americans, perhaps even a dangerous one, if contrary to science taught in the classroom, alongside the theory of evolution. Consequently, the fact that so many people in our country believe in Eden's literal existence may be unsettling to this group. And yet, as we shall see, many of these individuals, though often unknowingly, essentially still believe in Eden with profound environmental consequences. For a decade now, I've been making a study of Eden in pastoral literature. And what's come out of those years is the realization that it may be almost impossible for us not to believe in the notion that human beings once lived at peace with the planet. So persistent is this idea in Western culture, thanks to thousands of theologians, philosophers, playwrights, artists, musicians, and all sorts who've been propounding the idea. Denying that Eden was a real place would not only have been shocking during most of these centuries, but at times even heretical. Imagine scores of influential works like Silent Spring appearing annually, except in this case, each expressing an unwavering belief in a historical Eden. Continuing for centuries, the project both forcefully and subtly, as with the child who sighs when passing a power plant, reinforced belief in a literal Eden for each subsequent generation of Christians, including the most recent. Is it any wonder that half of America still believes in it? True, the belief may be grounded in the literal reading of a single text, such as the Bible or Quran, but every year thousands of new works appear to bolster this view by arguing that Eden was a real place where human history began. Far from faltering in the face of modernity, the project actually stepped up in the past century in order to protect Eden against the threat posed by science. Enormously successful, and this is important, the project spread outside of Judeo-Christian and Muslim traditions. Millions of Americans who might be mortified by the idea that they too subscribe to what they view as a potentially dangerous superstition threatening science and reason may nonetheless believe that there was once a time when human beings lived harmoniously with the planet. In other words, believe in an Edenic past. Works like Pocahontas, Avatar, and even Silent Spring, although hardly Christian allegories, nonetheless keep the myth alive, suggesting that somewhere, be it 400 years ago in Virginia, as in Pocahontas, light years from the Earth, as in Avatar, or a generation or two ago in small-town rural America, that we still had an environmentally perfect life as possible. Okay, so the objection is, but can't we say that human beings had at one point a much better relationship with the planet than we do now without believing in Eden? Maybe. But given how much Eden has influenced this belief, it's worth pausing for a moment to consider the two explanations for the existence of life on Earth competing for the American psyche, provided by the Bible and by the historical record and science. The Bible obviously offers Eden, perfect locus hominis. By contrast, the historical record gives us a far less rosy picture for human beings, as well as our relationship with plants, animals, and the planet. So what does the historical record tell us about our early human condition? So very quickly, life expectancy from prehistory through the ancient Greeks never exceeded 30. Assuming that you lived through infancy, which was unlikely, a range of horrific diseases and parasites awaited you, such as smallpox, typhus, leprosy, as well as dangerous pests like yaws and tapeworm. Death from starvation, exposure, accidents, predators, and infection, which could begin with something as simple as tooth decay, was common. Moreover, as Steven Pinker has recently argued, there was also the very real possibility of a violent death at the hands of other human beings. Animals in our path also suffered relentless violence at our hands. The late Pleistocene or Ice Age extinction event saw the mass disappearance of hundreds of species of animals just as human beings came on the scene. Over 40,000 years ago, when human beings first moved into Australia, 15 of the 16 genera of large mammals, and you know in taxonomy genera is the category up from species, 15 of the 16 genera of large mammals soon vanished. This pattern later repeated in Europe and in North and South America. Climate change, disease, and other factors no doubt also played a role in these extinction events, but early human hunters were a major factor. While there is a temptation, thanks to works like Dances with Wolves and Pocahontas, to see North America in particular as a place where human beings lived in sustainable peace with animals like the American bison, pre-Columbian peoples helped eradicate 75% of the continent's genera of large mammals. Not only animals, but plants in the landscape were severely impacted by the emerging human presence. Practice of mass deforestation, for example, which plays a major role in the West's first great work of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, followed human beings out of northern Africa and into Europe on its way to the Americas and beyond. Long before this, as early as the Neolithic period, like 12,000 years ago or so, fire was used for a variety of human projects, including hunting, the repurposing of forest land, and early slash-and-burn agriculture. This has not only impacted plants, but led to massive alterations to the environment. In North America, the ancient conversion of forest to grassland via fire helped create and enlarge the immense expanse of grassland at the center of the continent. This project of deforestation and landscape modification by Native Americans was so pervasive that in some parts of the North American continent there are more forests today than prior to the arrival of Europeans 500 years ago. The historical records suggest that for as long as our being human beings have neither lived at peace with the planet nor with the plants, animals, or ourselves. Moreover, confronted with a range of diseases and threats, the short lives of human beings were never particularly pleasant, whether 500, 5,000, or 50,000 years ago. From the perspective of the historical record, the myth of a perfect relationship with the planet is just that, a myth. So why does this secular belief in a version of the Eden myth of an Edenic past persist? So the aforementioned mountain of works arguing for Eden's existence for thousands of years obviously played a role. But it's important to note, in addition, that the pastoral tradition, formally inaugurated by the Greek Theocritus, added an air of reality to Eden, strengthening its credibility and influence. So while Eden in the Golden Age resided in the distant past, Theocritus suggested that in certain rural locales, which he imagined as pastures populated by sheep and their shepherds, human beings still lived at peace with the earth, which benevolently provided for their every need. Writing from the vantage point of one of antiquity's great cities, Alexandria, Theocritus was likely inspired by wistful recollections of his own youth, which were spent in rural Sicily. Paradise, proclaimed Theocritus, still exists, but only far from the corruption of civilization, which is especially rampant in its cities and courts. Thus, unlike Eden in the Golden Age, the locus amenus of pastoral art is imagined spatially rather than temporally, existing not in another time, the distant past, but rather in another place, certain rural locales. If you could flee the city and free yourself of its corruption, argued Theocritus, you might just be able to get back to Eden, or at least a secular version of it. Although Theocritus and Virgil, who together make pastoral art enormously popular, predate the Christian era, pastoral art and depictions of Eden were, so to speak, a match made in heaven. For centuries, scores of Christian writers and artists influenced by Theocritus, Virgil, and others would depict the pastoral locus amenus as surprisingly like Eden. Conversely, they also gave Eden characteristics drawn from the extensive tradition of pastoral art and poetry. For example, the notion that the climate of Eden was perpetually spring-like, which shows up in nearly all medieval and Renaissance depictions, does not appear in the Genesis account, but rather was imported from pastoral literature. Pastoral thus imbued the myth of Eden with an air of earthly possibilities. If human beings could, at least somewhere on Earth, still be living at peace with the planet, then the idea of Eden seemed less far-fetched. Conversely, if the biblical Eden once existed, then, just maybe, hoped Columbus and others, somewhere on Earth, human beings might still be living a pastoral Edenic life. Perhaps not surprisingly, even early in the game, belief that an earthly paradise still existed somewhere was met with skepticism, even in antiquity. In the second epode, Virgil's contemporary Horace intimated that such a view is really little more than an idealization of country life from the vantage point of the often dismal city. Perhaps not coincidentally, knowing what we do about his biography, this sounds suspiciously like Theocritus' own perspective from Alexandria. Furthermore, in The Winter's Tale, interestingly, Shakespeare further critiqued pastoral by drawing attention to a conspicuous feature of the art form, namely that the rural locus amoenus is often depicted like Eden in the Golden Age is lost to time, but in this case only recently so, as the perfect pastoral place is frequently imagined as having remained alive until just a generation or two ago. Shakespeare's apt psychological insight made by way of King Polixenes in the play is that this rather too coincidentally corresponds to the childhood of the person making the observation. This suspicion, which would be more completely theorized by Friedrich Schiller 2 centuries after Shakespeare, and even later by Raymond Williams, helps us further understand the birth of pastoral with Theocritus, who indeed was likely influenced by pleasant memories of his own childhood in rural Sicily. So, the critiques of pastoral made by Horace, Shakespeare, and many others compellingly argue that from its very beginning with Theocritus, the art form offered a wildly romanticized view of rural life born out of one, a frustration with the world becoming too modern, too quickly for our liking, and two, a dissatisfaction with city life. Pastoral, by the way, is usually an urban art form written by people in the city idealizing the country. There are exceptions like John Clare, but that's usually the pattern. Although not quite as influential as the idea of Eden, which is, after all, the creation myth for 3 of the world's most influential religions, pastoral nonetheless became one of the most popular art forms in the West. Taking Virgil as its model, most, and nearly all, I would say, medieval and Renaissance writers and thousands in the century since have tried their hand at pastoral. Generally, each encourage us to imagine a rural, recently lost Edenic scene. So where I think this becomes interesting from an environmental point of view is that in the 20th century, a range of environmentalists began taking advantage of how pastoral and the Edenic tradition works. So consider this. This is the opening of Silent Spring, Rachel Carson here. There was a town on the heart of once a town in the heart of America where all life seemed to live at harmony with its surroundings. So where and when was this? Carson, who is carefully employing the pastoral and Edenic traditions, implies that it was in rural America just a generation or two ago. Similarly, the film version of An Inconvenient Truth opens with the scene of a pristine river with a voiceover by Al Gore, and this is Al Gore. You look at that river gently flowing by. You notice the leaves rustling with the wind. You hear the birds. You hear the trees and frogs. It's peaceful. Gore and Carson are tapping into the amalgamated traditions of Eden, the Golden Age and pastoral. The reason for doing so is clever, as they want to draw attention to the loss of the locus amoenus they depict. No sooner do they present us with the soothing Edenic scene than do they rip it away. Carson wastes no time in doing so. As our third paragraph tells us, and this is Carson, a strange blight crept over the area and everything began to change. Some evil spell had settled on the community. So, like in the biblical account, it doesn't take long for evil to get there. Taking advantage of our belief in the Edenic past, which thanks to the pastoral tradition, we often imagine as having existed up until a few decades ago in certain rural locales, by the time Carson concludes her opening chapter, which is just 3 short pages, she has masterfully, without stating a single one of them, caused our opening questions to take shape in us. Environmentally, when did all this begin to go wrong? Why did it go wrong? Who is to blame? By the end of Silent Spring, Carson does this masterfully, I think. Will leave us not only with answers, but also with the hope that we can perhaps contain the evil we have unleashed. 10 years after the publication of Silent Spring, of course, DDT was banned in the US. I've repeatedly referenced Silent Spring because it is, as far as I am concerned, one of the milestone works of the 20th century, regardless of field. Like Special Relativity, one of the century's first great game changers, Carson effected a paradigm shift that had consequences far outside her original project of revealing the costs associated with indiscriminate pesticide use. By the way, she cleverly categorizes pesticides as biocides to draw attention they kill not only so-called pests, but all life. Not only, as suggested earlier, did Carson cause us to rethink biocide use, but a range of additional environmental practices, such as the consequences of the wholesale burning of fossil fuels. Other works, of course, played their role, but none had the impact of Silent Spring. For our immediate purposes, it's important to note that Carson also brilliantly worked out a way to make use of the inherited belief in an Edenic past. In the intervening 50 years, this approach has been followed by literally hundreds of environmentalists such as Al Gore and Michael Pollan. Knowing that her opening question is not far from the lips of her readers, each compellingly answers it with reference to their specific environmental concern. So, when did it all begin to go wrong? Carson's answer, with the widespread post-war use of biocides. Gore's answer, check the bottom of the hockey stick graph, about 200 years ago when we first started, unchecked burning of fossil fuels. Michael Pollan, with the growth of industrial agriculture, the loss of family farms. Once our opening question is answered, each writer can then move to the accompanying what, why, and who questions before addressing the larger issue of how we might turn back the clock to undo what we have done. Our continued belief in Eden in the conjoined traditions of Eden, the Golden Age, and pastoral can thus help bring about environmental consciousness, positive environmental change. In deference to Carson, Gore, and other committed environmentalists for whom I have great respect, I wanted to start my exploration of the Eden myth in this modern way on a positive note, as it is often useful to look back to a time when things were, at least regarding the particular issue referenced, in some ways better than today. Taking advantage of our belief in the Edenic past, this approach has quite a bit of rhetorical punch. It certainly can, as Carson proved, help bring about positive and widespread environmental change. However, environmentally, belief in an Edenic past also has worrisome consequences. The problem is that Eden stands between us and the future. Insofar as Edenic thinking imagines a harmonious relationship with the past, it encourages us to attempt to turn back the clock to regain it. Obviously, such thinking is directed toward the past, not the future. Of course, the French philosopher Rousseau famously expressed this idea 250 years ago with the now familiar phrase, back to nature, which is probably better literally translated as return to nature. In practice, this is little more than a secular imperative, urging us to return to Eden. Because the Edenic tradition encourages us to envision a past more appealing than the present, and thanks to the influence of pastoral, such a past is often imagined as still existing just a generation or two ago in rural locales, the past is offered as an attainable paradigm for the future. This project, of course, is doomed to failure. Not only can we never return to Eden, relegating the future to the past is fraught with difficulties. So I want to start with a familiar example. This is where genetics I need help with. Heirloom vegetables and fruits, which of course in recent years have become incredibly popular, not only in farmers markets, but in supermarkets as well. And people have just woken up to the fact that that the vegetables we had before were bred sometimes by industry for dubious characteristics, for color, for size, for thick skins, for easy ways to be transported and all. Heirlooms are an appealing alternative, as they date from a time before the agricultural industry began undertaking the large-scale genetic alteration of fruits and vegetables. So the exact definition of an heirloom is still being debated. Some experts argue that any vegetable cultivar that is at least 50 years old is an heirloom. Concerned that this would allow certain early hybrids to receive the classification, some would like to push the clock back further, perhaps to 100 years. Alternately, fixed dates, usually around 1945, which roughly correspond to the introduction of industrial hybrids, have been suggested. Hybrids, which are the first generation of a cross between two different plant varieties, enter into this debate for a number of reasons, but chiefly, as Michael Pollan and many others have repeatedly argued, because the seeds of hybrids do not faithfully reproduce the parent. And having grown up on a farm in southern New Jersey and being an avid farmer, I can tell you, you plant seeds of a hybrid, you will be disappointed. The plant will not reproduce its parent. In contrast, traditional, what are known as open pollinated plants, produce usable seeds with consistently desirable qualities, usually anyhow. Consequently, unlike open pollinated varieties, growers cannot use the seeds of hybrid crops to produce new plants, but must purchase new seeds every year. Hence, companies that produce hybrid seeds have, as Michael Pollan suggests, and this is Pollan, the biological equivalent of a patent. Farmers now had to buy seeds every year. Instead of depending upon their plants to reproduce themselves, they now depended on a corporation. It's difficult not to be moved by Pollan's argument, which is made in the spirit of American environmentalists like Henry David Thoreau. 150 years before, and Walden similarly railed that the goal of the clothing industry was, and this is Thoreau, not that mankind may be well and honestly clad, but unquestionably that the corporations may be enriched. Thoreau sounds very modern there with corporations, doesn't he? Anyhow, If hybrids are the problem, why does the age of a vegetable variety, be it 50 or 100 years, enter into the definition of an heirloom? Why, indeed, is the issue framed between hybrid and heirloom rather than between hybrid and open pollinated variety? Environmentalists like Carson and Pollan are not the only ones in how to employ the appealing myth of an Edenic past. In fact, as Pollan makes clear in *An Omnivore's Dilemma*, a new literary form has recently emerged: supermarket pastoral. In order to sell pricey products, supermarkets first sell the dream of an Edenic pastoral past. Walk into any Whole Foods market, notes Pollan, and you will see hundreds of signs and labels that either describe or picture the product as part of an Edenic or pastoral scene. In so doing, retailers leverage the work of activists like Carson and, ironically, Pollan himself, who've argued in the past 50 years or so we've made significant and harmful changes to the environment through, for example, the introduction of biocides in hybrid vegetables. Heirlooms, by definition, promise a fruit from before the environmental fall from grace, so to speak, as they are imagined and marketed as living artifacts carefully handed down from a time before everything began to go wrong environmentally. Similarly, organic vegetables promise return to an era before biocides. Thanks to the pastoral and Edenic traditions, this makes heirloom fruits and vegetables easy to understand and to sell. The distinction between hybrid and open pollinated is, by contrast, somewhat complicated and confusing. Consequently, in part because supermarket pastoral much prefers the Edenic and very marketable label heirloom, it stands in opposition to industrial hybrids rather than open pollinated in the public imagination. Okay, but if, like Theocritus, fondly imagining a pastoral scene, we find the charm of heirloom fruits and vegetables appealing and are willing to pay our grocers for providing it, what's the harm? Well, in the past 50 years, both large-scale and small-scale growers have, through traditional open pollination, produced an astonishing number of new vegetable varieties. There's nothing new here, as this is how, before hybridization came on the scene, heirlooms themselves came into existence. For example, the black crim, you may know this is like a burgundy brown tomato, owes its existence to an early ancestor on the Crimean Peninsula from over 200 years ago that gave birth to over 50 varieties of Russian black tomatoes. The heirloom black crim is just one of a variety from this very fascinating and I think kind of tasty family tree. In this case, however, it is a variety whose characteristics were locked in decades ago, hence its heirloom status. However, in the intervening years, dedicated gardeners and growers worldwide have, through a variety of ways, including traditional open pollination, been improving Russian black tomatoes further, creating whole new varieties in the process. So why attempt to improve on a classic? Well, you know, for the same reason that gave birth to those original 50 varieties, to make them tastier, juicier, more tender, and all that. With global climate change looming, the project has new urgency, as these tomatoes need to be, by being more drought, heat, and disease resistant, prepared for the future. While growers can somewhat improve the heirloom black crim by selectively saving only the best, hardiest seeds, any new variety created from it would no longer be, by any of the definitions proposed, an heirloom. Consequently, now that heirlooms are big business, we risk having a generation of growers set aside the millennia-old project of creating new and better varieties of vegetables. For all life, the future belongs to each new generation, not the last. The myth of an Edenic past, however, is standing between the heirloom black crim and its future, by not allowing its progeny, recent varieties derived from it, to succeed it. In that sense, Eden not only threatens the teaching of evolution, but now the process of evolution itself. Now, I do know that heirlooms, of course, give more genetic diversity. There's this great library that they offer. Being an avid gardener, I get that. But I also am concerned that just, holding on to this idea of this perfect thing from the past can have problems as well. And that's, in that sense, in their own small way, heirloom vegetables like Eden stand between us and the future. They offer the profoundly alluring but impossible dream of returning to a time before things went wrong environmentally. In the process, they carry with them a tempting answer to our opening questions, as they are marketed with an explanation of what went wrong, as well as why it did and who was to blame. To the delight of grocers everywhere, they promise to mitigate the problem through their purchase. The danger here is the slavish devotion to the past hinders our acceptance of the future. Devotion to the past can also carry surprising environmental consequences, in this case by severely limiting genetic diversity. Heirloom fruits and vegetables are a modest example of Eden's impact. In contrast, its influence has also been enormous, as the myth has shaped how certain environmentalists imagine our future relationship with the planet. As incredible as it may sound, some of these individuals, like Christopher Columbus before them, recently set out to find Eden. Horrified at the present state of the environment, yet believing that somewhere in our past we lived at peace with the planet, in the closing decades of the 20th century, these individuals searched for the remnants of lost Edenic life. They did so not because they were devout Christians, but committed environmentalists. Consequently, the earth was scoured for cultures that, still innocent and untouched by modernity, had seemingly not yet lost paradise. In the Americas, the indigenous people of the Amazonian rainforest were touted as prime examples. Native North American cultures that had existed up to a few generations ago were also repeatedly referenced. By the way, this particular belief became very popular in the early 1970s, in part thanks to an enormously influential article by Stuart Udall, who was the Secretary of the Interior under Kennedy and Johnson. The article he wrote was called Indians, First Americans, First Ecologists. These cultures were often offered as a paradigm for the future, as they had not, it was argued, given into our temptations and made our mistakes. Even if we were not always clear on exactly what went wrong for us environmentally, given that so much obviously has, here is a chance to turn back the clock to a time before it all began to fall apart. The obvious difficulty here, though, of course, is the Edenic image that we hold of pre-Columbian American cultures often runs counter to what we know about their actual relationships with each other, animals, plants, and the planet. This is not to say that these cultures have nothing to teach us. Certainly, obviously, they do. But it's worth pausing to ask what it is we see in them. Is it an answer to our opening question, do we see ourselves before it all began to fall apart environmentally? Do we honestly believe that they can help us turn back the clock to regain what we believe they never lost, paradise? Incidentally, it should go without saying that seeing the vast variety of rich Native American cultures, not for who they are, but rather as an upended projection of ourselves, does them, a huge disservice. The hope that we can return to Eden is perhaps even more appealing than Eden itself. Especially in environmentally troubling times, its allure is obvious. It offers the simplest of all answers to our problems and questions, the imagined simplicity of a time that predates both. Wistfully pining for an Edenic relationship with the earth we believe we once had and lost may seem harmless enough, but it can turn worrisome when we seek to assign blame for our environmental woes. In other words, when we set out to name the evil that corrupted paradise. This, incidentally, is where it starts to shift and create concern because of what early environmental humanists were doing with respect to some of these issues. So I'll give you an example. The Death of Nature is an influential 1980 book by ecofeminist Carolyn Merchant. It opens with the image of an Edenic world recently lost that had remained unchanged since prehistory. As late as 1500, Merchant argues, most human beings, including Europeans, still live such an Edenic life. So what happened to change all this? Read like a whodunit, a prime suspect soon emerges in the Death of Nature. According to Merchant, perhaps more than any other person in history, Francis Bacon, the so-called father of modern science, is responsible for the death of nature. This general thesis, which strongly links science and technology to our environmental crisis, was not new with Merchant. A decade before, Lynn White Jr., in a work even more influential than The Death of Nature, argued that, and this is Lynn White Jr., that the Baconian creed that scientific knowledge means technological power over nature may mark the greatest event in human history since the invention of agriculture, and perhaps in non-terrestrial terrestrial history as well. Science and technological modernity then, and this unfortunately did come from the environmental humanities. Science and technological modernity then are thus implicated in the loss of our Edenic life. In this sense, Eden not only threatens the teaching of science in the classroom, it fosters a general suspicion of it on environmental grounds. Following White and Merchant, hundreds of environmental writers, probably thousands of environmental writers, have in a host of ways subsequently made much the same argument. This is hardly surprising, as the idea has been alive and well in the U.S. for centuries. In The Machine in the Garden, Technology and the Pastoral Idea in America, which is a classic work of literary criticism from 50 years ago by Leo Marx, Marx noticed that depictions of technology repeatedly and intrusively enter Edenic and pastoral scenes in American literature. Examples of The Machine in the Garden of Eden include the train heard from Walden Woods and the steamboat that separates Huckleberry Finn and Jim. American literature, which is filled with such scenes, is particularly revealing because, influenced by the myth of Eden, it repeatedly depicted North America as a pastoral locus luminus, which incidentally likely influenced why people like Udall and others imagined Native Americans as innocent inhabitants of an Edenic land. And by the way, Marx knew, and I think most people in the field know, that There were not only just depictions of North America as a locus hominis, but it was a strand there that I think he was right in identifying. At the same time, the rise of American literature in the past 3 centuries paralleled the growth of technological modernity. Consequently, for hundreds of years, hundreds of American writers have told the story of a pastoral, Edenic land threatened by the intrusion of science and technology. As with the extraordinary influence of the Eden myth and Greco-Roman pastoral, American pastoral, which frequently identified technological modernity as an evil, threatening paradise diffused into the popular imagination. You do not need to have read Walden to find science and technology environmentally suspect. It is written large in the American landscape. For example, power plants with billowing smokestacks have simultaneously become icons of environmental devastation and technological modernity. However, like the myth of Eden, in many ways this stands counter to what we know to be the case, right? Namely, the science and technology have done much to improve the human condition over the past few hundred years. Our lifespan has nearly tripled, infant mortality has been reduced by an even greater factor, many deadly diseases are now easily inoculated against, and so forth. In developed countries, i.e. countries with technologically developed infrastructure, food, water, effective sanitation, medical care, adequate food, and most needs are met with for most people. It'd be easy to fill an hour talking about what technology has done for us. It can, of course, be countered that all this comes with significant environmental cost. There's certainly some truth to this, but again, consider the example of Silent Spring. What made Carson's argument so pervasive that it was thoroughly informed by a painstaking scientific analysis of what the effect that biocides had on living organisms. It's hardly surprising, by the way, as Carson had a master's degree from Johns Hopkins in zoology. After spending 16 chapters answering our opening questions, explaining what went wrong environmentally with the sort of precision that only a trained scientist can offer, Carson concludes our final chapter and the book by referencing a poem by Robert Frost. This is Carson. We stand now where 2 roads diverge. The road we have long been traveling is deceptively easy, a smooth highway on which we progress with great speed, but at its end lies disaster. The other fork of the road, the one less traveled, offers our last, our only chance to reach a destination that assures the preservation of the earth. So, the question is, what's Carson's road less traveled? Given that she explains in detail the dangers of certain laboratory chemicals, it's the project of Silent Spring, we might expect her to recommend that we try in some way to turn back the clock to a time before scientists began meddling with such things. Such a move would hardly be surprising, as many environmentalists have made similar recommendations in the past 50 years since the publication of Silent Spring. In the process, often unabashedly implicating science for the loss of an imagined and Edenic pastoral past. So if you wonder where this gulf emerges from between the environmental humanities and sciences, this is a major, major part of it, I would think. But instead, Carson argues that science itself needs to provide the answers. Suspicious, I'll buy it, of direct chemical control of insect populations, she turns instead, and this is Carson, to the vast field of biology, where entomologists, pathologists, geneticists, physiologists, biochemists, and ecologists are all pouring their knowledge and their creative inspiration into the formation of a new science of biotic control. Once the underlying biology of the organism, the pest, is understood, the one that we seek to control, Carson argues we open up the possibility of making a biotic intervention, such as by rendering sterile the flies that spread malaria. This, to Carson, and I think logically, is far more benign than the wholesale application of DDT to the environment, where it endangers a host of organisms. Although Silent Spring opens with the description of a pastoral scene, Carson does not seek to return to the pleasant past she invites us to imagine. Rather, like the superhighway of the biocide industry she rails against, Carson's road less traveled is also headed into the future. Acutely aware that science and technology can unleash a host of environmental problems, and again, this is the project, this is what Silent Spring sets out to prove, Carson yet does not give in to the temptation of seeing science as essentially evil, the killer of nature, which is in some sense, an apt description of bioscience. Nor does she pine for a time before the problems that she documents came on the scene. Rather, building on the amazing achievements of countries with technologically developed infrastructures, she looks to a future born out of, and this is Carson, a new imaginative and creative approaches to the problems of sharing our Earth with other creatures. Obviously aware of the immense appeal of an Edenic past, she is, after all, a pioneer and rhetorically using it to great effect environmentally. Carson does not allow it to turn her away from the future. Inspired by the example of Rachel Carson, I am firmly of the conviction that the future belongs to the future, not the past. Detached from the environmental context we've been talking about, this point is so obvious it hardly seems worth making. After all, what would be the alternative? Do we attempt to fashion the future into a vision of the past? The problem, as we all inevitably come to realize at some point in our lives, is that the past, whether remembered or related to us, is rarely as rosy as it seems. Yes, the idea of returning to a time before we release millions of tons of greenhouse gases and toxic chemicals into the environment is certainly appealing. However, our problem, as Carson realized with crystal clarity, is with the present, not the future. While our knee-jerk response to the present state of the environment may be to turn away from a future born out of it, which presumably holds even more of the same, in favor of an imagined, some would say imaginary, pastoral past, Carson, in spite of being acutely aware of major threats to the environment, unflinchingly looks to the future for creative solutions to the problems. Yes, the past will certainly play a role in the future, as ignoring its lessons would of course be foolish. But as Carson makes clear, the future needs to emerge out of the present, even with all its problems. In order to build a future better than the one we have in the present, a future better than the present, we need to face our problems head on, and then, according to Carson, seek and implement solutions that take advantage of our present state of knowledge, which obviously involves science and technology. In practical terms, even if we so desire, it would be naive to think that we could stop the juggernaut of technological modernity from moving into the future. Belief in Eden, belief we once lived at harmony with the earth, is immensely appealing, especially when a harmonious relationship with the planet now seems almost incomprehensible. Is it any wonder that, as technological modernity was emerging on the scene 250 years ago, Rousseau, seeing what was on the horizon and believing we once lived at harmony with the earth, urged us to return to nature, to return to Eden. Unfortunately, as no such place ever existed, if the historic record is to be believed, we cannot return to Eden. Rousseau's imperative, although a wildly popular mantra for more than 2 centuries, is simply impossible to follow. Indeed, it's nonsensical. We cannot get back to nature because nature, i.e. a perfect human relationship with nature, never existed. If we are to get to nature in this sense, it will not be by going back, but by moving forward toward it. As Carson realized, the relationship with nature better than the one we now have will no doubt be complex and difficult to forge, and it will be found in the future, not the past. The paradigm that has ruled for millennia, which Rousseau made into a maxim, needs to shift as back to nature falls away, and I would argue forward to nature takes its place. Given that the present state of the planet, it may be difficult to even imagine human beings having an ideal relationship with the earth, but as the future of our species hangs in the balance, it's imperative that we work toward it. Is such a goal realistic? Well, maybe not. At least not in the sense of a truly perfect relationship, but it's far more realistic than believing that we can somehow return to such a state. I would argue that this issue is, in some sense, even more important than the other legacy of Eden, the long-running debate over evolution and creationism. In both, science is found to be suspect, perhaps even evil, dangerous. However, while the evolution controversy certainly has important implications, some of them environmental, such as postulating human beings as superior to other forms of life on the planet by virtue of a separate and privileged creation, the astonishingly pervasive and persistent legacy of Eden, even in the secular world, has had that Eden in the secular world, the belief that we once had a harmonious relationship with the earth, has extraordinary implications. Eden not only challenges the teaching of science in the classroom, it affects the foods we eat with heirlooms, the clothes we wear, the places we live, and hundreds of additional practices. Moreover, it turns us away from a future born out of the lessons from the past. It's not just that Eden offers creation as an alternative to evolutionary biology, it stands defiantly as an alternative to evolution and progress themselves, arguing against the scientific and technological evolution of our species, offering instead a reactionary future that is somehow to be found in the past. In short, we need to put Eden and Edenic thinking behind us. This is easier said than done, even if widespread belief in the biblical Eden came to an end. And there's no indication this is happening anytime soon. The notion that human beings once had a harmonious relationship with the planet is deeply rooted in the American psyche. To displace it, we have to reverse the backward orientation of 5,000 years of Western thinking. I think this will be difficult, but I think it can be done. After all, public opinion reversed on coal-burning power plants in a single generation. For such a reorientation to happen in this case, for the paradigm to shift, We need to take a sobering look at the history of the relationship that our species has had with the planet, which, regardless of what we have been told, was never especially good, let alone Edenic. Once we accept that harmony between human beings and the earth is not to be found in the past, we need to turn our eyes to the future. The phrase "forward to nature" may seem odd, counterintuitive, and misguided, perhaps even uncanny. Yet back to nature, the words that sound right to our ears not only sound so, because of our unfaltering devotion to an ancient myth, as wildly improbable as it has been successful, that has made Edenic thinking ubiquitous. I do think the time has finally come to put the idea of back to nature behind us. The fact that for 5,000 years we've been sold this idea again and again, so that it's no longer in any way, no longer just a religious belief, but is somehow, in the American psyche that this is what we are. I think that's a problem. The people that originally propounded it, like Rousseau, Henry David Thoreau, it's interesting enough, but early people working in the environmental humanities, and I mentioned Carolyn Merchant, Lynn White Jr., there are quite a few others, jumped on that bandwagon, saw that as an actual reality, that we had that relationship, and then began looking for where it went wrong. And unfortunately, repeatedly, they came back with one answer, that the sciences somehow caused the problem. I think that has to be rethought. And I'm not the only one, and I guess that's the optimistic way to end this, is that many people in the environmental humanities are reevaluating earlier work and would very much like to sort of, heal the rift that has been opened up, in part by people working in the environmental humanities. So, that's it. Oh, sure. Please. By the way, I absolutely hope to open up controversy here. And I expect it from a range of different ways. I mean, this, by the way, I should mention, is not the book that Lars mentioned, but it's coming out of another book that I'm working on now for a general audience. And it's meant to stir up debate and to reevaluate some things. Please.
Very well. Enjoyed it very much. And everyone at Farm as well. And also studied sort of theology and politics. And one sort of query, one aspect of your sort of eating that seems left out, but that might actually open up a new way of understanding the narrative. That might be more positive than you actually suggest. So one thing you don't mention in your Eve story is the way in which, in Genesis account, God gives human beings the gift of land, and also responsibility for actually sort of maintaining it in a certain sense. So Christian sort of evangelicals now think creation care is sort of responsibility, based on that sort of Edenic narrative. And many secular writers, like Wendell Berry, for example, sort of refute White by saying this actually is a gift of responsibility for us. We need to be good stewards of that land, of that earth. And so, in that sense, you can see, if that's part of the story that's getting left out of your narrative, you can see that science has an important role to play in helping us be good stewards of what we've been given. And so that might open up new ways to actually understand a positive relationship with the earth that might not be simply a return to the past, but also return to stewardship in a certain sense. How would you sort of interpret it?
I am well aware of this, and Wendell Berry is actually a friend of mine. So the fact is, though, the passages you're referencing kind of specifically are Genesis 1:26 and 1:28. The idea that human beings are given dominion over the earth. And I've written a good bit about this, looking at the way the Hebrew functions there. And more importantly, though, it's the way that the Latin functions there, as the text that was read more often than any other as the Bible of record was the Vulgate Bible throughout history. And the word there is always dominus. It is being lord of something. You mentioned stewardship, and actually I'm one of the people that argued for a stewardship model emerging somewhere in the 16th and 17th centuries. It's not necessarily inherent in Christianity that stewardship approach has historically been there for a while. Jeremy Cohen wrote a great book in 1989, actually based on a chapter from Genesis chapter 2, and he argues that historically it's kind of a mixed bag how human beings interpret it. At the end of the day, though, I agree with what you're saying in the sense that this is a question of interpretation. It's a question of the way the Bible was interpreted, how you do it, what languages you use, the strategies that you use it, and it is reassuring that there are a generation of people, and Wendell Berry is an example of it, who want to interpret it in an environmentally friendly way. And the go-to example for this will always be, nowadays, Al Gore. Al Gore is a committed environmentalist, very devout Christian. He's found an interpretive way of reconciling these things. But with these approaches, though, you don't necessarily have to believe in a literal Eden either. But yeah, no, I do take the argument. Yeah.
So, in sort of talking about, historically, were humans in harmony with the environment or not? Sort of, I think one piece there that I think maybe left out is the scale. And historically, I would argue, people when they caused problems in their local environment, they could move to another environment. And because of exponential growth of population and with the Industrial Revolution, exponential growth of application of energy, to the Earth, we've sort of, I would say, there really is sort of a categorical break in the last, say, 100 years, where now, we can ruin the whole planet, and that's sort of the existential, threat that gives, I think, some of the environmental movement, an extra caution right now, and maybe that turning to the past isn't necessarily a solution, but it colors how we move forward and how we think about technological solutions.
Yeah, Al Gore, by the way, wonderfully makes this into an icon during an Inconvenient Truth. He has a PowerPoint of a shovel, it's a simple shovel, and next to it, a huge, massive, steam shovel, a huge diesel machine that can, move literally 1 million times more earth in one scoop. But the problem is, and it's interesting you mentioned it this way in terms of population. Well, first, population is not the only part of that equation. You have to take into account both population and, at the other side, resource consumption and then emissions too, in a modern sense with like CO2. That's why it never works one-to-one comparison. The United States, our population is not as great as some other countries now, but our consumption is so high that our footprint then is that much larger. But it's
exponential growth, it's sometime last 100 years, not 5,000
yeah,
years ago.
But if you look at the historical record and you see where population and resource consumption will go hand in hand throughout history. So a perfect place to look is 2,000 years ago with Rome. Only because the population for the first time soared to a city of 1 million. That didn't happen again into the West until right around the year 1800 in London, which is the period that I look at. Baghdad actually was bigger, but in the West it's different. But it's a great point because we assume, what you mentioned there, technological modernity, the so-called Industrial Revolution, is the problem. That brings us back to this divide because that's caused by science and technology and all that. But if you look at it back to Rome, back to pre-1800 England, London, where it increases in size, you realize it's a host of other factors that caused our environmental problems. For example, I've argued that by the time Milton writes Paradise Lost in the 1860s, that respiratory illness caused by air pollution is probably the second leading cause of death behind the plague. This is before industrialization. This is before anybody other than a few select people in the Royal Society were taking bacon seriously. These were changes in practices that had very little to do with large-scale technological innovations that were being propelled by science. So I hear what you're saying, but I want to de-yoke the two of them to blame just science for these issues. Steve.
So you kind of talk about an environmental gooseness curve. And there are more examples, right, where if you plot on the horizontal axis an environmental problem on the vertical axis, deforestation, whatever you want.
Right.
In many examples now, there's a hump. And for a while it gets worse. And then you become wealthy and you forget to mow your lawn or whatever. And it starts to get better. So you can now fish in the Monongahela. You used to be able to cook fish on the burning Monongahela. And people watch nature shows where behaviorists convince whooping crane chicks that they're mama and fly them to the olive. So there are many examples now where we've crossed the hump and are headed down the other side. The question is, in literature, is there any emerging narrative about those examples? And if so, who gets the credit? Is it good scientists versus bad scientists? The scientists all the time knew how to do it. and some lone crusader gets the credit? Is there any narrative at all?
Okay. So I ask my students this question. I say, on the one hand, talk about, first question, dystopias. Books that you know that are dystopias. The Hunger Games, there are a ton of them out there, dystopias. They have one answer after another. I say, name a recent utopian literature. It's not their fault. There aren't out there. That's the problem. So in a way, though, I mean, you've wonderfully jumped right on what I wanted to say, is that this idea that the better future is back to nature, that's been around so long that we need a new narrative, which is that forward to some better way of approaching things. That's in my opinion, the saddest part of this legacy from Eden is that we just want to constantly look back to the past rather than the future. And honestly, I think, Rachel Carson had it right. I mean, is the answer the scientists were all good? No. Rachel Carson had a mountain of evidence to show that science can cause problems. She had a mountain of optimism to say that science can solve those problems too. But that's a different orientation than that we often have today. So the answer is no, not much of a narrative. Now, all the writers here should start in on that, by the way. Go ahead, Lars.
I've got a question that relates a little bit to the initial question here.
Sure.
It's about how you think, and clearly you do it in different ways in your argument about Eden. But I'm going to phrase it this way. What do you think is the function of the idea, the role of the idea of Eden in the human condition? And let me put it this way, that while we're outwardly wasting away, we're continually renewed by principles and ideas and ideals. And so you can ask yourself whether it's part of the human condition to need guidance in the form of ideals. This is very much a Plato-type argument.
Right.
Guidance of knowing what is the world with me and without me. Nature versus me. And that's a long history argument, of course. But an example would be, and I think this may be different a little bit from your argument. So I'm Swedish, but I'll do something about America here. The Supreme Court always reinterprets the Constitution in the modern world, but the ideals persist. Right. So that seems slightly a different take than what you're arguing.
Yeah, I mean, first off, because of the...
I'm sorry, and by the way, the Constitution has very much an idea of nature as endowing on us as people certain ways. So
no, I'm not. I think you're right. I mean, and first off, I mean, the wonderful position we're in is to sort of cherry pick from the past what we want and leave what we don't want. It's interesting, so ideas included. But what's interesting is that with respect to Eden, this debate has been always raging, but say in the 17th century, it raged between poets. So on the one hand, you had John Donne. He thought the world is in a state of irretrievable decay. After the fall, everything is gone away. Another person, Milton, who I write on a lot, argued just the opposite, that we are in a state, have the possibility of taking a stewardship role in regenerating the planet. So they're both in the Eden tradition, both saw that there was something in the past, but Milton said, yes, but we can take it upon ourselves to regenerate the planet into something new. As I understand it, that's kind of behind what Al Gore is about now. So it's faith-based, it's inspired, it's seeing ideas from the past and ideals from the past, but believing that we can somehow recapture it. That was a radical idea at the time, by the way, because many theologians just thought that the world was, the earth was basically evil, Satan was free here, that we, should, in a Platonic way, sort of rise above it into something beyond physics, the metaphysics. But no, I mean, it certainly can, and I think it can have a major role in it. Yeah?
If environmentalism is so heavily dependent on this Edenic myth, and myth is wrong or misguided, that general line of thought be used to spread of environmentalism?
I don't think that environmentalism has been, though, and honestly, if we break this down to the two cultures, and I do think that Rachel Carson is a great example of, unlike C.P. Snow being a good example of someone straddling the two. The environmentalism that came out of Carson, which gave rise to the EPA not long after she died, that itself has led to an optimistic, hands-on, often science-based approach. That's what most of the people here in PEI do. My concern, however, that there has been at times a knee-jerk response to that, saying, well, wait, we're going to lump together all science together and we're not going to think about how it can be constructive and all. But I don't think that. But to answer your question, there have been very extreme environmentalists. I would name someone like Dave Foreman, who is the vice president of the group Earth First in the early 1990s, who was making some very, very radical statements like that and calling all human beings like a cancer on the earth and all. So that's pretty radical. But I wouldn't lump together all environmentalists that way. Yeah.
One last question.
Oh, sure.
I've just been thinking, once in a while when I read an article about some new environmental technology, like a company invents a power plant that can run by burning garbage and it can do it cleanly, there always seems to be a quote from some environmental group that's saying something like, even if it is really clean, we still shouldn't do it because it's going to encourage people to generate more garbage. And I think you hear the same kind of thing with with carbon capture and storage stuff. Like, even if we can make the technology work, we still shouldn't do it because that'll just make it easier for people to use a lot of energy and produce a lot of pollution, even if we can deal with the pollution. So do you think that type of attitude is another aspect of what you've been talking about, and what do you think is an appropriate response to those types of statements?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, and CCS is a good example. Wendell Berry, who was referenced before, Wendell Berry is going on record and saying that the problem with technology is technology created so many of our problems, and technology, when you apply it to solve the problems, you just create more problems too. So there's that deep strand of pessimism, and I do think it comes back to this basic idea that if things were bad. If things were all great at one point in time, what changed it? Was it population? Was it consumption? Or was it an intervention of a major way by something like science? If that's the answer, then science always winds up being suspect, it seems to me. Or not always, that's too strong, but there's often a tendency to be very concerned about what science is doing and whether science, which presumably creates all these problems, which I don't think it did, then science, will science then create more problems with it? And I think you're right on it, because I think that's a basic strand in this kind of thinking, and it's very disturbing to see it, because CCS. I mean, who knows how it'll play out practically, economically, or the way that it'll actually happen? But wouldn't that be great? You know what I mean? If it actually worked, if someone could come up with an economical way of doing it now that lasted and worked, I mean, who wouldn't want that? You know what I mean? But the fact that people are suspect of it in a knee-jerk way, that is disturbing to me. Yeah.
All right, let's thank Ken for great discussion.
Oh, thank you.